Connor didn't recognize me at first, standing at the front of that conference room in a suit instead of my gray maintenance uniform. It took him almost 15 seconds to understand that the man he complained about to human resources, the old janitor he'd told his coworkers should have retired years ago, was the same man whose signature was on every paycheck in that building, including his own. 15 seconds. I counted because I'd waited 10 years for that particular 15 seconds, and I wasn't going to miss a moment of it. Let me back up, because to understand how my stepson ended up humiliating himself in front of 40 of his own colleagues, you need to understand something about the man he'd been quietly disrespecting since he was 15 years old. My name is Walter. I'm 62, and 3 days a week, I put on a gray company-issued uniform with the name Walt stitched over the breast pocket, and I do maintenance rounds through the headquarters of Sterling Dynamics, checking HVAC systems, fixing jam doors, replacing burnout lighting in the parking structure. Most employees who pass me in the hallway nod politely and keep walking, the way you'd nod at any building maintenance worker. Nobody stops to chat. Nobody wonders where I go when my shift ends. What none of them know, what I've made sure none of them know, through a fairly elaborate amount of quiet effort, is that I founded Sterling Dynamics 31 years ago, and I still own 82% of it. I started as an apprentice machinist at 19 years old, in a machine shop that made small custom parts for the aerospace industry, sweeping floors and running errands before anyone trusted me near a lathe. By 26, I'd saved enough and learned enough to buy out my aging boss when he wanted to retire, a $14,000 loan from a credit union, and a lot of nights sleeping 4 hours so I could run the shop floor myself before opening the office in the morning. Over 3 decades, that single machine shop grew into Sterling Dynamics, a precision manufacturing company that now supplies components to 3 major aerospace contractors and employs just under 900 people across 2 facilities. I could tell you the whole story of how that growth happened, but the part that matters for tonight is this. Somewhere around year 15, after the company had grown past the point where I recognized most of the people on the floor, I made a decision that most of my board thought was eccentric and my accountant thought was borderline insane. I told my executive team I wanted to keep working the floor myself, in disguise, so to speak, not as the owner walking through for a photo op tour, but as an anonymous maintenance employee a few days a week indefinitely. I had my reasons, and they weren't complicated. I'd watched too many founders I respected lose touch with the people actually running their machines, making decisions about factory conditions and shift schedules from a glass office they never left. I didn't want to become that. So I created a legal arrangement. My general counsel handles it, along with 2 board members who know the truth, where I'm employed under a slightly different legal name, Walt Nash instead of Walter Nash Sr., doing genuine, useful maintenance work, 3 days a week, drawing an ordinary maintenance salary I don't even deposit, just to keep the arrangement clean. It lets me hear what people actually say about their shifts, their managers, their pay, when they think no one who matters is listening. It's the single most valuable business practice I've ever adopted. And it's also, as it turned out, the thing that would eventually put me in a room with my own stepson without him having the faintest idea who he was talking to. Here's the complication nobody, including me, planned for. 12 years ago, I married a wonderful woman named Linda, a hospital administrator I met through a mutual friend, 3 years after my first wife passed away. Linda came with a son, Connor, 15 at the time, angry in the particular way that teenage boys get angry when their mother remarries, and I never once tried to force my way into being his father. I tried, instead, to simply be steady, present, someone who showed up to his baseball games and never raised his voice, even when he clearly wanted me to. It mostly worked. Mostly. There's a moment from those early maintenance shifts I still think about, because it's the reason I never abandoned the arrangement, even when it became inconvenient. About 4 years into wearing the gray uniform, I overheard two line supervisors in the break room discussing a safety shortcut a regional manager had been quietly encouraging to hit quarterly targets. The kind of thing that never makes it into a formal report because nobody wants to be the one who flags it to the executive team. I raised it the next morning as Walt to my own safety director without explaining how I'd heard about it. We fixed it within a week. I've never told that story to anyone outside the company until now, but it's the clearest proof I have that the uniform was never about hiding from my family. It was about hearing the truth before anyone had time to polish it for me. I want to be honest here, because this isn't a story about a stepson who was cruel from day one. Connor's resentment of me in the early years was ordinary and understandable. The resentment of a boy who missed his own father and didn't ask for a replacement. I never held that against him. What it eventually hurt over time was something different. It wasn't resentment anymore by the time Connor hit his early 20s. It was embarrassment, because to Connor and to nearly everyone else in his life, I was simply Linda's second husband, the guy who does maintenance work somewhere. I never corrected that impression. I'd built a habit of humility so deeply into my life by then that hiding my ownership of Sterling Dynamics from Connor felt like an extension of the same discipline I applied on the factory floor. Not a lie, exactly, just an omission I decided for my own reasons to maintain. Connor decided, somewhere along the way, that my modest job was something to manage around rather than simply accept. When he brought his first serious girlfriend home for dinner at 21, he introduced me in front of her as my mom's husband. He does maintenance work. It's fine. Don't worry about it. The don't worry about it, doing a great deal of quiet, dismissive work in that sentence. At his college graduation, when a friend's father asked what I did for a living, Connor jumped in before I could answer and said, "He's basically a handyman, nothing fancy," in a tone that made it clear the subject was closed. By the time Connor was 25, the pattern had calcified into something closer to habit than active cruelty, which somehow made it worse. At a 4th of July barbecue 2 summers ago, one of his co-workers asked me directly what I did, and Connor answered for me again. A reflex by then, saying with a little laugh, "Walt does maintenance work, minimum wage stuff, blue-collar guy. Not really a career, you know." I remember Linda's hand tightening around her lemonade glass. I remember saying nothing, the way I'd said nothing 100 times before, because correcting him would have unraveled 10 years of careful anonymity over what felt, in the moment, like a small and forgivable insult. If you've ever let something small go unaddressed because you told yourself it wasn't worth the conflict, you already know what happens next. It doesn't stay small forever. It just waits for the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. If you've ever let something small go unaddressed because you told yourself it wasn't worth the conflict, you already know what happens next. It doesn't stay small forever. It just waits for the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. There was one dinner about a year before all of this that I think about as the clear sign of how deep the assumption had settled. Connor had just landed his first real job interview, and over dessert, he half-joked that if it fell through, he could always end up doing something like Walt's job, worst-case scenario. Linda laughed it off. I laughed along, too, the way you laugh at a joke that isn't really a joke because the alternative was a conversation I still wasn't ready to have. I remember driving home that night thinking that Connor didn't see my work as a job at all. He saw it as a cautionary tale, a fate to be avoided rather than a life someone might actually choose and be proud of. For Connor and me, that moment arrived at work because 8 months ago, without either of us planning it, my stepson became my employee. Connor had struggled to find steady work after college, a communications degree, a series of short contract jobs, nothing that stuck. When a logistics coordinator position opened up at Sterling Dynamics through a staffing agency Linda mentioned in passing, Connor applied on his own, was interviewed by our HR director, and was hired entirely on his own merits. Nobody on the hiring panel knew he was my stepson because Connor carries his father's last name, not mine, and I've never once put my thumb on hiring decisions below the executive level. I found out he'd gotten the job the same way any other father finds out. Linda told me over dinner, delighted, and asked if I'd put in a good word if I ever ran into him around the building. I told her I'd let him find his own way. I meant it as respect for his independence. In hindsight, it also set up 10 months of the strangest, most quietly painful workplace experience of my professional life. Connor worked in the logistics wing on the second floor. I did my maintenance rounds through that same wing twice a week. He walked past me dozens of times over those 10 months, nodding the same distracted nod he gave every maintenance worker, never once looking closely enough to recognize his own stepfather in a gray uniform with a laminated badge that simply read Walt. I watched him grow, honestly, in ways that made me proud, watched him get better at his job, watched his supervisor start giving him more responsibility. I also watched him twice make comments about the maintenance guy to his cubicle neighbors that I happened to overhear on my rounds. Nothing about me specifically, just the same casual dismissiveness toward blue-collar workers he'd always carried toward me at home. Now aimed at strangers doing the same job I was quietly doing beside him. The moment that changed, everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was replacing a ceiling tile near Connor's desk when he got into a heated exchange with his supervisor about a shipment delay that, frankly, was his own scheduling error. Frustrated and not realizing how close I was standing, Connor said, loudly enough for half the floor to hear, "This place has people mopping floors making more sense of logistics than half the actual staff. Maybe we should promote the janitor and fire whoever scheduled this." A couple of coworkers laughed uncomfortably. His supervisor didn't. 2 days later, Connor filed a formal complaint with HR, not about himself, but about me. He claimed that the maintenance employee, Walt, had been loitering near his desk, listening in on private conversations, and made him uncomfortable. He requested, in writing, that maintenance staff be reassigned away from the second floor during business hours. I want to be honest about how I felt reading that complaint once it worked its way, as all formal complaints eventually do, across my general counsel's desk and then mine. I wasn't angry that he'd complained. Employees are entitled to raise concerns. And in an ordinary sense, Connor wasn't wrong that I'd been near his desk more than usual, though not for the reasons he assumed. What stung was smaller and older than that. It was the casual cruelty of, "Maybe we should promote the janitor," said about a stranger, echoing, almost word for word, the same dismissiveness he'd aimed at me across 100 family dinners, now revealed as something he genuinely believed, not just something he said to smooth over an awkward introduction. It was time Connor learned exactly whose company he'd been quietly disrespecting for 10 months, and exactly whose family he'd been quietly disrespecting for 10 years. My general counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla, had handled complaints against Walt Nash before. Rarely, but it had happened, and there was a standard protocol, a mediation meeting between the complaining employee, their supervisor, HR, and the maintenance worker in question, held in a conference room on the executive floor, since that's where HR's larger meeting spaces were. What was not standard, and what Priscilla and I discussed carefully before agreeing to, was at this time, I would attend the meeting not as Walt the maintenance worker, but as Walter Nash, founder and majority owner of Sterling Dynamics, the identity I'd never once used inside these walls. I made the decision for a reason that had nothing to do with revenge, and I want to be clear about that, the same way I was clear about it with Marcus's story a few weeks back. I could have quietly resolved the complaint as Walt, kept my secret intact, and let the whole thing fade into HR paperwork. But some things, left unaddressed, calcify the same way Connor's disrespect had calcified over a decade. I decided that my stepson needed to understand, once and clearly the actual cost of the casual contempt he'd been carrying toward people he considered beneath him, and that the only way to make that lesson land was to let him see it happen in real time, in front of witnesses, the way he delivered his own comment in front of witnesses 2 days earlier. Connor walked into that conference room expecting Walt, the maintenance man, his supervisor, and an HR representative. Instead, he found his supervisor, Priscilla, an HR director, and standing at the head of the table in a suit he'd never seen me wear, in a role he had no idea existed me. It took him almost 15 seconds to say anything. Dad. He finally managed. The first time, I noted quietly that he'd ever called me that without hesitation. What? Why are you? What's going on? Priscilla answered before I did, in the flat, professional tone of someone reading a matter of record rather than delivering a punishment. Connor, this is Walter Nash, founder and majority shareholder of Sterling Dynamics. He's also, I understand, your stepfather. He's been employed here under a separate arrangement, performing maintenance work under the name Walt for the past 16 years. Connor's face went through the same sequence I imagine most people's faces go through in that particular kind of moment. Confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, sinking recalculation of every dismissive comment he'd ever made, both at this company and at our kitchen table, replaying itself behind his eyes in real time. You own this whole company, he said quietly. You're the janitor I complained about. I'm the maintenance worker you complained about, I said. I've also signed every paycheck you've received here for the last 10 months. Nobody in that room laughed. I made sure of that beforehand. I told Priscilla clearly that this wasn't a moment for humiliation theater, only for honesty. I addressed the complaint itself directly and fairly. I confirmed on the record that Walt, the maintenance worker, had done nothing inappropriate near Connor's desk, that the loitering was ordinary building maintenance, and that no policy had been violated. The complaint was closed, formally, exactly as it would have been for any other employee. Then, once Priscilla and the HR director had stepped out, I stayed behind with my stepson, and I told him the rest of it, the part that had nothing to do with company policy. 10 years, Connor, I said. 10 years of don't worry about it, and nothing fancy, and not really a career, you know. I let it go every time, because I told myself it was easier than making you uncomfortable in front of your friends. I was wrong. It wasn't easier. It just taught you that people who do this kind of work, the actual work this company runs on, are beneath the conversation. And 2 days ago, I watched that lesson come out of your mouth about a stranger the same way it used to come out of your mouth about me. Connor didn't say much that day. He asked to take the rest of the week off, which I granted, and Linda later told me he spent most of it in his old childhood bedroom, barely speaking, the way people do when they're forced to rebuild an entire private narrative about someone they thought they understood. When he came back, he asked me for something I hadn't expected. He asked if he could shadow me on a maintenance shift once, just to understand what the work actually involved. I said yes. We spent 4 hours together replacing air filters and checking pressure gauges in the boiler room, mostly in silence, though it was a different kind of silence than the one we'd shared for a decade. Less avoidant, more like two people finally occupying the same room honestly. I didn't fire Connor, and I didn't promote him out of guilt either, because both of those responses would have taught him the wrong lesson. That consequences for contempt are either total destruction or a reward, with nothing honest in between. What I did instead was ask Priscilla to enroll him, along with every new manager at Sterling Dynamics, in a mandatory shift rotation program I'd been meaning to formalize for years. A policy requiring anyone on a leadership track to spend 1 week a year working an entry-level floor position before their next promotion review. Connor wasn't singled out. He was simply the reason the policy finally got written down. There's one more piece of this worth telling, because it surprised me more than the meeting itself did. About 2 weeks later, Linda sat me down and told me something she'd been carrying quietly for years. That she'd always sensed Connor's dismissiveness toward me bothered me more than I let on, and that she'd never push me to correct it because she didn't want to force a confrontation that wasn't hers to start. She said watching Connor's face in that conference room, secondhand, through his own retelling, was the first time she fully understood how much that decade of small comments had actually cost me. We didn't need to say much more than that. Some understandings don't require a long conversation once they finally arrive. 6 months later, Connor still works in logistics, and he's good at it. Better than before, if I'm honest. Something about that conversation seems to have sharpened his attention to the actual people executing his schedules rather than just the schedules themselves. He still calls me Dad now. Not Linda's husband, not Walt. It's fine, don't worry about it. Just Dad. It took him 25 years to say it easily, and I'll admit, I don't take a single instance of it for granted. As for the gray uniform, I still wear it 3 days a week. Some habits I've learned were never really about staying hidden. They were about staying honest with myself. No matter what title ends up on the door of the office, I never spend enough time in. Here's what 3 decades of walking factory floors has taught me. You can learn almost everything you need to know about a person's character by watching how they treat someone they believe has no power over their life. Connor didn't disrespect me because he knew I was powerful and resented it. He disrespected the version of me he believed was powerless, and that, in the end, told me far more about the lesson he needed than any paycheck ever could. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to look closer, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there are a lot more quiet workers and a lot more overdue reckonings still to come. I'll see you in the next one.